I'm Ted Wittenstein. I've been assisting Professor Nordhaus in the Carbon Charge Task Force over the course of the past year, and we're very grateful for the presentation. Just to remind you guys of what the format will be, a few quick opening remarks from our provost, Professor Pollack. Professor Nordhaus will maybe give a brief overview of the Presidential Carbon Charge Task Force report, which of course you can also view in full online in the announcement from President Salve and Provost Pollack transmitting the report earlier this week. Following the presentation of the report, we'll just sort of open it up to Q&A from the audience. We have some other members of the task force who are with us who might also participate and share some of their thoughts, and we'll have about a little bit of a discussion. So thank you very much for your time, and let me introduce Provost Pollack. Thank you.
So welcome, everybody. Suitably not hot Earth Day today. So I wanted to just start by thanking some people. I want to thank Bill Nordhaus for having chaired the committee. I think this task force is kind of a model example for how you can get students and faculty and staff working together on serious university problems, university challenges, and I particularly want to thank the students involved who I hear from everybody were just terrific. For the faculty, Professor Nordhaus doesn't need any introduction from me. He's a former provost. He's probably the foremost economist working on this problem in the world, and personally speaking, he's a mentor and friend. The other faculty involved included Dean Ted Snyder from SOM, Law Professor Dan Esty, who recently was the Energy Commissioner for Connecticut, from Forestry, Professor Brad Gentry, who chairs Yale Sustainability Advisory Council, former Dean of SOM, Sharon Oster, another teacher of mine, former Deputy Provost and former Chair of Political Science Department, Francis Rosenbluth, the Director of the Yale Climate and Energy Institute, Mark Pagani, and the Chair of Radiology, Professor Peter Glaser. So it was a kind of an all-star group. Kind of amazing to be able to put together a group like that to look at a problem like this. And I also want to thank the staff people who worked on this, John Bollier, Ginger Chapman, Linda Lorimer, and especially Ted. Now, the report Bill's going to go through in a minute and go through some of the details. I want to emphasize where we are. We have this report, and I want to separate my own view of what I see is going forward. So let me give you my own view first of all. I will admit it, I'm kind of an enthusiast for this thing. I really like this idea. I think it's the right idea. I think it puts Yale in the right place. So I'm pretty excited about it. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? There's going to be lots of opinions. This is kind of the beginning of the journey, not the end of the journey. There's going to be a lot of people have a lot of views, perhaps there's lots of views in the room. And I think part of the excitement is going to be seeing what happens next. But there are many parts of this I like, and I could go through all of them, but I won't because I think I'll leave it to Bill. But the part that I do want to emphasize is how this is right for Yale, why this is the right environmental practice and policy for Yale. Yale's mission is educational, and for Yale to try to design something like this and try to put it in practice as a sort of an experiment is an incredibly important educational thing to do. It's a lesson for the world. We're already attracting enormous attention in the US from our peer institutions as we try to do this. And even if we fail to do this, I've already given away that I kind of hope we're going to succeed. But even if we fail to do this, we're going to learn a lot from what it takes to try this and from failing. So I think this is win-win. I mean, I think it's a big win with a capital W and capital I and capital N if we get it done, but it's a win even if we fail because we're going to learn how hard it is. And I'm already realizing how extremely hard it is. Now, if it's going to work, and it's going to work as an educational thing, that means clear communication and clear education, and the person who is best at explaining why this is, what this idea is, how things like revenue neutrality work, why pricing of carbon is a sensible way to think about the world. The person who's best capable in the world to do that is Bill Nordhaus. So let me sit down and stop boring you and let the person who actually knows about this talk about it. So Bill.
Well, I was definitely hoping Ben would go on a little longer, so I could listen to the distinguished provost talk about where we are now. The only question is, where are we? Let me push the wrong button here. There we are. So what I'd like to do is walk through with you the findings, recommendations, pitfalls, advantages of a carbon charge at Yale. What I want to do is, let me just start out by saying failure is not a word in my vocabulary. Discouragement is not a word in my vocabulary. 2 steps forward, 1 step back is a phrase in my vocabulary. So I don't know what will happen with this program. I very much hope it will go forward. I think the other members of the task force do as well. But at this point, it's just a blueprint, and we're handing the blueprint off to the people who build things in the provost's office, the president's office, facilities office, and around the campus. But let me go through the blueprint. So I thought it might be useful to start with the major recommendations at the outset, so you can get a feeling for the general structure, and then we'll go back over the details. Okay. First, we were asked whether Yale should introduce a carbon charge, and the answer is yes. We would like to do it starting in the next academic year, and it will be phased in over a period of 3 years. I'll talk at the end about why a phase-in seems a reasonable thing to do, but the answer to the first question is yes, we should. I'll talk later about the pricing issue, or the charge issue, the level of the charge. We spent a fair amount of time on this issue, and we ended on what we think is a conceptual and ethically correct level of the price, which is what's called the social cost of carbon. I'll explain that a little later. There are alternatives that we could have chosen, but this is conceptually clear, and then once you've got the concept, it's pretty easy to implement. Something that's very central to this proposal, and I think most puzzling to most people, the one I've had most difficulty understanding myself and explaining, is the idea that this is a revenue neutral program. And what that means is it has charges on all the units, but it has rebates to all the administrative units, and those net out to 0. So this is not a tax. This is not something to raise revenue for worthwhile programs. We have many worthwhile programs, but that's not the point. It's central to the design of this, and I think to the acceptability of this, that it be seen as something that's not a tax, not a subsidy either, but that it's revenue neutral across the different administrative units of the university. Now, to be revenue neutral, you have to have some way of levying the charge, and the way it's done is on a unit's net emissions. So it might be the School of Music, it might be athletics, it might be medical school, it might be library, and there would be I'll explain this a little more later, but there would be a little given base level of emissions, and you would be charged on whether, a unit would be charged on whether the emissions were greater or lesser than this base. And the base is set in such a way, to a first approximation, so that the sum of the bases is the sum of the emissions for the university, so the sum of the differences is 0. And that's how you achieve revenue neutrality. Now, there's an issue of what the footprint is, and we have a person who's the czar of footprints joined us, and we'll hear later about that. But the question is, what does this include? Does it include central campus? Does it include medical school? Does it include remote facilities? And the answer is, it's a conceptual answer that everything the university has operational control over. And so that's basically, you can think of everything where the university pays the energy bills. It excludes things that the university has financial control over. So if we own a company in the endowment, that would be outside the purview of this. But if we run a company, then that's in the purview. So you can think of Yale's obligations as being ones relating to its operational activities and ones relating to its financial activities. Financial activities are governed by a different set of principles. We actually don't have a set of principles for operational activities, and I see this as a set of principles that apply to operational as opposed to financial ownership. So I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. So those are the 5 key points, and what I want to do is go through those, sketch over those in the next few minutes. Let me say, just remind you of the presidential charge. President Solvay, that he asked the task force for a blueprint and to introduce it early this year. So this is pretty early this year for piloting in the next academic year. So to a first approximation, we're doing what the president asked. Let me mention the members of the task force. I'm not going to read all of them. Provost actually mentioned all of them. I would like to say that it's been a great group of people to work with. These are people who are knowledgeable about different corners of the university. It's a very complex place, different schools, different colleges, different operational units, and we've been very lucky to have the people involved who have given their time. And also I'd say that we've had a lot of advice and counsel from people inside the university and people outside the university. We had a meeting in December of experts from not just Yale, but from companies and universities around the world even, and we got a lot of advice from that. So this is the cast of characters. Okay, so let me say something about carbon pricing. So carbon pricing has emerged, I may speak more generally for a minute, as a central tool for reducing greenhouse gas and CO2 emissions. We moved in people's thinking from quantitative limitations to pricing. And the primary reason is that pricing is something that affects everybody. The big people, the little people, the governments, the firms, individual consumers, and in a very even-handed way. And so one of the insights we bring to this is, why not do that at Yale as well? Move from the quantitative targeting of an earlier era to a price-type targeting today. Now, I should say that while this is experimental or innovative, it's not brand new. There are carbon prices that have been introduced in different places. The European Union has had them for about a decade. British Columbia has actually had a carbon tax for, I guess, 4 years. And actually, it's a model in the sense that it was a revenue neutral tax. They actually did differently, obviously, because governments do different things from what institutions do, but they did the same thing. They levied a tax and rebated it. And it's been very, very effective there. Many companies use internal carbon pricing, and a few companies have introduced it, non-energy companies, and Microsoft and Disney. And they're basically, they have a different approach than we do. They're using it to recoup the costs of their sustainability programs rather than as a way of, for damage purposes. Let me just say that Yale's carbon charge is not a Mickey Mouse idea. It's not one to cover sustainability. It's not low level. It's not for public relations purposes. It's really designed to be a statement and also to affect our behavior. So let me say a little bit about the purpose. I will go over this pretty quickly because Ben mentioned these, but one thing that we don't often think about is that we're presumably, and we hope, moving into a high carbon price world, and we want to be ready for that. We don't want to be sitting there without our different programs being prepared for that. So this program is one that when we get to a high carbon price world, we can just shut it down because we will be ready, we will be prepared. We also want to introduce the idea of carbon pricing at an institutional level as an institutional innovation. It's not that it's never been done, but we want to think about how you actually flow these decisions down to decision makers at different levels of the institution. Just again, to emphasize the idea of prices as a tool for decentralized decision making, rather than having the president or the provost say, do this, do that. You actually present people with prices that say it's a little more expensive to do that, it's a little more expensive to use energy, maybe a little more expensive to fly around the world, and a little less expensive to get on the telephone, and to tilt people's behavior toward low carbon activities. And then, as the provost did mention, and I would emphasize, well, let me back up. At our December meeting, Professor Frank Wolak of Stanford said, one thing about about Yale's program, no matter what you do, you are not single-handedly going to solve the climate problem. You are not, through individual steps that you're going to take here in New Haven, going to make a big dent on climate change. And I think we recognize that. But we think our role is not to actually change the global emissions, but to introduce policies, to introduce ideas, and what I call institutional innovation. They show the kinds of tools that can be used not to build an iPhone, but to change the way people's behavior, the way people behave. I think I will just quickly say that on the prices, there are different concepts. We settled on what is known as the social cost of carbon, which is the estimated cost of an extra ton of emissions. We think that's an ethical standard that we would recommend, rather than something like what you can buy an offset for or what it costs for your sustainability program. Once you accept that, that has been carefully analyzed by the federal government. It's been litigated by the federal government. It's used in federal regulations. And so we don't need to rediscover this. It's right there, and we suggest using it. If you take that charge and Yale's estimated emissions, the total gross charges would be about $12 million a year. And then, of course, all of those get rebated, so the net charges would be zero. This is something about the boundary. I mentioned earlier that the footprint, if you like, or what they call in tax theory, the tax base of this would be operational control, and that we thought the best way to define that is if the university directly or indirectly pays the bills, the energy bills. It's an operationally pretty clean concept, and so that's what we adopted. And therefore, it covers all our sites: Central Campus, Medical Campus, West Campus, remote facilities, athletic facilities, and so on. And it would be levied on all units, just as energy charges are now. Okay, so if you ask, well, there are lots of different, as any of you who study this know, there are lots of different emissions. There are carbon dioxide emissions, and there are other kinds of greenhouse emissions, and then there are direct emissions, and there are indirect emissions, and there are indirect emissions. So where do you draw the line here? So we recommend it at the outset to only include energy emissions from energy use, either direct that we burn here on our campus, or indirect that we buy from somebody else, the electricity we purchase from someone else. Those are what are known in the ugly technical language as scopes 1 and scopes 2. And I mentioned what those are. Now you can go on to other scopes, scopes 3, and those get more complicated. Everything has some carbon in it. Your telephone, your telecommunications, your air travel, your cement use, and so on. And we don't have the same kind of measurements there that we do on energy use. So we think we would like to include air travel, which is extremely energy intensive, and maybe some other associated with construction, but we're not ready for that. We as a university are not ready for that, and so we think that needs to be studied carefully before implementing. But we would like to move on. We would recommend moving on to that. Again, this concept of revenue neutral has been mentioned, and I'll just say it's revenue neutral, not in the sense it's revenue neutral that's zero for every unit, but it's revenue, it's zero for everyone summed together. And as I mentioned, that's used for used in different places. So a kind of key point here is that if you think of a unit which has zero if it doesn't do anything, then if it reduces its emissions, it gets 100% of the benefits, in the sense that if it reduces emissions by 10 units, it gets 10 times $40 of a rebate. On the other hand, if it decides to build a whole new building and has large emissions associated with that, then it would pay the increment of that. So it's a key idea here that your programs are unaffected if you behave in an average way, but you have an incentive to reduce emissions, and you get 100% of the benefit of that. Now, I won't get into Yale budgeting because it's a very painful subject. It's just painful because it's the most obscure system known to humanity. And any of you who've dealt with it, I know at least one person in this room who's dealt with it, probably just feels pain in thinking about it. Well, there are two of us in an earlier era. No, it's a very complex system. But I would say there are two kinds of units at Yale. There are those who pay all the bills or lots of the bills and have a kind of at a bottom line of net revenues and net operating income less operating expenses. And there are other units that don't even see the bills. And so in some way or another, roughly half of the schools and departments, schools and units around the campus pay their bills and see their energy bills, and roughly half don't. So what we're proposing, I'm oversimplifying, what we're proposing is for the units that see the bills, or that have well-managed and large budgets, we pass the carbon charge through to them, even if they don't pay the energy bills now. But there are other units, residential colleges, linguistics department, maybe some small libraries, just small units that don't actually have very large budgets and don't manage them in any real way. And for those, we need to use what we call behavioral approaches coming out of behavioral psychology. You can consult with the president on that. Behavioral programs, experimental programs, to see what works, to give people more awareness of what their energy use and emissions are, and how to reduce them. Finally, on phase-in, late in the day, I have to admit, I thought we could, let's just go right on full steam ahead next year. And then I went to talk to somebody, and they didn't say you're crazy, but they said, we're not quite ready for this. We can't realistically do this all next year. And so explained to me patiently why, and I said, that sounds correct. So what we're recommending is that we phase it in. We pick a few units for the next year, big units, medium-sized units, small units, and then gradually phase it in over the next 3 years with full implementation by the third year. And we also recommend that in good academic tradition, that it be studied at the end of the period to see how effective it is. So that's it. That's an overview. You can get all of the details in the report. Again, I'd like to thank our task force and people who worked with us. And if I might add, we have some people here that might say a word, and I'll start with Sharon Oster, who chaired one of our working groups on pricing.
Thank you, Bill. So thank you, Bill. This was actually a really terrifically interesting task force for me to be on. I feel like I learned a lot about both the science and the way the university works. So I just want to say a couple of things about what we hope for from this charge and some of the complications that I think people in the audience can help us think a little bit about going forward. The goal...
Sorry, can you use the podium because we're recording this?
Is this okay?
That's fine.
Okay. Sorry. So we are intending, as Bill said, to set the carbon charge at the social cost. For an economist, the advantage of doing that is as decision makers think about things like how to turn on the lights or whether to shut the windows. The costs that they are going to face in making those decisions include all of the private costs they've always faced, but also will now, under this charge, include the cost of the social damage they're doing to the environment and to society when they don't shut the lights off. So that's the sense in which using that social cost as a charge is very appealing. And our goal then is when people make decisions that they include that social cost in their decision making. Now there's the place where we need a little bit of help, because what imposing the charge will do is to make salient to, for example, the dean of my own business school, what the cost is of the activity of the people under his purview. The way more difficult thing to do is to make that charge salient to the individuals inside of each of the institutions. Having Dean Snyder know that shutting the lights off imposes a charge on the school and a social cost on society is very different from having one of our students understand the impact of his or her action, and how it is that the deans and the decision makers at the budget level of each of the parts of the university are going to translate their understanding and their incentives into the creation of incentives for all of the decision makers scattered throughout the university will be a very interesting challenge, and I think a lot of our learning is going to be involved with figuring out how the different deans push down and really decentralize this charge so that everybody sees it and feels it and acts according to it. So that's where I think we're going next, and I think for those of you scattered at the university, that'll be an interesting challenge.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Milikowski. I'm one of the student representatives on the task force. Just to speak a little bit about sort of student perspectives and how we use student opinions in shaping this recommendation. So we held a student forum here that hopefully many of you came to in the fall. And I just want to confirm that we really took a lot out of that. We actually got a lot of ideas from that student forum. And so I was really excited to be able to bring a lot of student opinions and suggestions to our meetings. I know there's a lot of support and desire among students to really make sure this charge was impactful and broad-reaching. And I think that we really did a good job of balancing that with practical aspects of this charge. As Bill sort of alluded to, it's going to be a process learning how to implement this charge. In Yale Budgeting, I've only learned a little bit of, but it is truly very complex. And so I think it's really important to keep in mind that a charge on some aspect is really much better than no charge at all. And the way that I think we get to having the type of impact that we want and having this charge be applied in every area that we want is to make sure that it's applied first in these areas really well and really effectively and doesn't overly burden, those who need to implement it. And so I think that there was a lot of student desire, and my personal desire as well was to make sure that this charge does ultimately cover some Scope 3 emissions, which are those non-energy emissions such as air travel, which is a really large part of our university's footprint. But I do think that we need to make sure we get the right data so that we make sure when we do implement it, we implement it really effectively. So I certainly want to hear student opinions on our recommendations, and certainly any, if you have criticisms, absolutely, we'd love to hear those, but I do hope that people keep in mind that I think scaling this up over time in a really effective way will be the best decision. As Bill mentioned, I was in charge of the footprint committee, so just to sort of reiterate what I just said about scaling up over time to cover more emissions, that was also sort of the thought process in terms of footprint. We wanted something that was really clear and really simple in terms of what was included and what was not included in the charge. And we thought that once you started sort of making exceptions for certain units or buildings, you can really open the door for everyone asking for an exception. So we wanted a really clear footprint that was really easy for people to understand, again, trying to set us up for the most success moving forward as we try to scale it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I will just say that it was a tremendous learning experience for administrators and staff to hear from Professor Nordhaus, Professor Esty, Professor Oster, and really understand how academic approaches to sustainability and to carbon pricing could translate into operational concepts of how the university is run. And so I really think there's something special about the task force and the energy it created in terms of thinking about how the academic life of the university, how the operations of the university, how student life of the university can really be integrated together for approaches to sustainability and climate change. And so I think that was one of the most interesting things to sort of understand and witness in the scope of this process. And it has really sort of inspired, I think, a lot of other schools who've been interested by this. So I've already been sort of getting calls from some of our peer counterparts interested in this concept. Professor Nordhaus mentioned the other universities that participated in December. I think there's a sort of growing recognition, if you could think about areas where Yale really could make an impact on climate change, areas that really could be, if replicated by Yale and other peer schools, could have tremendous impact. This might be one of them. So with respect to carbon pricing, if there is a model here, even at a smaller scale, even imperfect in some ways, but something that could be a start that could spread to a number of other like institutions, you're beginning to sort of get at a larger national problem that I think a lot of people are excited about addressing. So Yale is, of course, an innovator in a variety of different ways. And so institutional design is one of them. And if you could sort of think about how academic research and teaching can inform a university policy, this is just an interesting example of that. So this is obviously the beginning of the conversation and not the end. Nothing is sort of final in terms of how this will move forward. But I think in terms of starting off the conversation, this is a really interesting first step. So I'm very appreciative to Professor Nordhaus. So thank you. So what I'd like to do is just sort of open this up to questions from any of you. Maybe just say your name and where you're from in the university, and we'll take it from there. We'll pass the microphone around just to make sure everyone can hear you. Please, in the back.
Sandro Gomez from Mechanical Engineering and Material Science. We all been facing, the idea is very good.
We have the mic.
Oh, that's on. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, the idea is very good, of course, but it would rely on an extremely efficient organization, which Yale is not. So you're proposing to hit on the emissions. We have no control on the emissions. We basically depend on controlling the emissions on the temperature we set on our thermostat. For example, the thermostat in the building I work with, the dilapidated Mason lab, depends on whatever physical plants decides to do. And sometimes we call in because the temperature that they claim they've set is the wrong temperature. So as a result, we usually freeze in the summertime and we are overheated in the wintertime. So there is no way, in my understanding of what you're trying to do, to hit on the emissions unless you reform physical plant, which is probably a very tall order.
Well, I won't get into the debate about the pros and cons of that, but actually I want to address the deeper question of whether people have any control. Can you hear? I'm not sure. Is this on?
Yeah, it's on.
Whether people have control over their emissions. I think we underestimate the ways in which we do. Now, we don't have 100% of control, but we have control over lighting. But actually, one of the most important ways we have control is in our laboratories over the equipment we use. And that is something where most people around the campus actually pay relatively little attention to the energy efficiency or lack of efficiency of the equipment. It's a particularly pernicious problem because of the incentive of federal overhead structure, where often equipment will be exempt from overhead, and the energy isn't even charged. So you've got a whole set of incentives about what kind of energy using equipment, what the energy use is, what is bought, And this is not just in laboratories. This is pretty pervasive. So one of the things, let me say, this is actually quite a difficult issue to try to think of how we would include not just structures and lighting and heat, but energy-using equipment and choices there. We had some ideas in the report, but we recognize that that's difficult. I have to say you have a really important point, though, and this Jennifer also made, which is that a lot of people just don't pay attention to this. This is just not on the radar screen of many people as to what their energy use is and what they can do. So a very important part of this, we think, is to actually make people aware of it by giving them information on both of those two things. And that's more difficult, but we think that is part of the program. And finally, I might say that we're very interested in doing some experiments. So we think if in fact we do go ahead with this, we would do this in the spirit of research as well as emissions. That's to say, we would do some experiments where we would do some randomized treatment across departments or across schools or say across residential colleges. So you can do different treatments and you actually see whether it makes a difference. So if you're right, it doesn't make any difference. And at the end of 5 years, everybody's right on baseline and there's no difference at all. Well, that actually is really useful information. But we do have experiments out there that suggest that these kinds of things, information about use, information about how you can change behavior, and incentives, all of those do matter for energy use.
I think it's an excellent point and sort of speaks to my question about whether we can get some behavior change from the charges. One of the things that we thought in the task force is that if you tell people, and this perhaps reflects the economics thinking of some of us, if you tell people there's some resources at stake, either that they have to pay or that they can receive, it creates some incentives to them to go to the facilities people and say, we'd like to be better, what can we do? And so we've suggested to the administration that resources may need to be put into the facilities area to provide some consultation to groups about what they can do, short of re-insulating and fixing the heating system on an everyday basis to actually achieve better carbon emissions control.
Hi, is this on? Can you hear? Robert Dubrow from the School of Public Health. So I have one brief comment and then one question. So the comment is that, I think like the issue of the, things permeating down from the dean is important in terms of individual behavior, but there are also important structural solutions. So just for example, in my building, the lights are on, 24 hours a day, day and night, when a lot of the lights don't need to be on for most of that period. And, so simple solutions like motion sensors and, like in the hallways, maybe having on nights and weekends, having every fourth light on instead of all the lights on, could save a lot of energy. So that's more structural than individual behavior. And then my question is, in terms of the net carbon emissions and having the historical levels be the baseline, did you talk about like gradually reducing baseline so that, in order to force, behaviors in terms of lower emissions?
I'll just take your question and not the comment. We actually proposed two different ways of doing this. One was you set a baseline by university total, and the other one is the way you suggest, which is to have a percentage change that's in advance, and it could be some target or it could be some historical change. Each of those has advantages and disadvantages. I would just say that the disadvantage of the second one, let's say you set an ambitious target, 10% a year or something like that. The disadvantage of that is that you're going to start raising a lot of revenues from the units, and you might end up with the units having a net charge of $5 million a year. So the advantage of the first plan, which is revenue neutral every year, which is you set the baseline to move with the university total or average is that it's actually revenue neutral year by year. We lay both of those out. I've used the revenue neutral year by year because it's easier to explain, but both of those were laid out in our report.
And just to respond really quickly to your comment, I think it's a great point, but I think to Sharon's point, there's also a behavioral aspect to that. All of a sudden, the payback period on making those motion sensor lights becomes a lot shorter. And then there's also sort of the behavioral aspect of making the person who has the control over those lights and the decision-making ability to put those motion sensors in all of a sudden more aware that it might be something worth considering. So I think even though you're right that a lot of these changes are structural, they're small, and getting someone to take the initiative is a really important first step. So we're hoping to instigate that.
I meant to preface my remarks by saying I think this is a great initiative, and I really hope it's successful.
Could I just follow up on your first point, though? I might mention that part of the sustainability initiative that the president announced last fall was an increase in the budget for energy efficiency around the campus. I've been asked, do we do too much? Do we do too little? Do we do about right? I don't know the answer. I know the University of California system is doing much more than we are, but they're a bigger campus. But I do think one of the things we hope will come out of this will be attention to the kinds of issues that have been raised, doing careful analytics of what you're getting, where the payoffs are. I talked to John Bollier, the head of facilities, and lighting actually is one of the big initiatives over the next few years. So I actually think facility gets a pretty bad rap around the campus. I think if you would go if you spent more time, I'm not recommending because you have other things to do, but we spend a fair amount of time with facilities, hearing about the programs. There's a lot going on. I'll just mention just one other point. When we met with other universities, so one of the key issues is you got to measure things, right? You can't charge anything unless you get emissions. You can't get emissions unless you measure them. So you got to have measurement and monitoring around the campus. I was really surprised. Yale is way ahead of many of these other universities. Many of them don't even monitor buildings. Don't even have careful measurements of buildings. So I think that's one place I felt very good about not just Yale, but this program was we actually are. We're not obviously not perfect, but we're pretty far along in terms of the basics of just pure measurement of what different buildings and different units do.
James Ball with the School of Forestry. First, I want to just echo the thanks for the tremendous work and the decision coming out. I'm personally very excited about it. My question is in regards to, one, the observation that we have a lot of diversity across Yale, and it'll be interesting to see how in different environments we have this grows or is met with rejection in different environments, but we all have a Mother Yale above us. And my question is, I think some would associate that culture of Mother Yale as one of abundance and wealth and being able to have all that Y brings. And I wonder if this program being implemented implies a kind of shift in identity or a cultural shift for what it means to be a member of the Yale community.
Yale is about, we say it in the management school, but people say it all kinds of different ways, educating leaders for business and society. I think Yale, you may think of it as abundant Mother Yale, but I think we think of it as socially responsible Yale, and I think that's the spirit in which this really emerges. Ben Pollock's trying to make us not be so abundant feeling anyway.
I would emphasize the point I made in my presentation. We've thought very carefully. I mean, there's a big debate at this university, as in other universities, about divestment. I think of that as ethical responsibility with respect to your financial investments. We've thought a lot less about ethical responsibility about our operations, what we do on campus, how we do with respect to, say, animals and other things. But in this area, I see this as extending our feeling of social responsibility to our operational activities. And it's a pretty, I was quite interested how little people think of that as an aspect of, for universities, of ethical responsibility. I think in business there's more, but it's actually relatively little operational responsibility, ethical responsibility. So I thought this was actually a step down that road.
Hi, I'm Gabe Brissman. I'm a member of Yale College. I came 20 minutes late, so if this is already covered, let me know. But when I was reading the report, I noticed that there was a overall focus on reducing consumption, and a huge part of the reason why a national or any other level of carbon tax is good is that it encourages a transition to alternatives or renewables because it fairly prices the bad and allows room for the good. And I don't really see any focus on renewables or energy switching in this plan, and I was wondering if that's because of the unit-by-unit nature, where Yale Facilities controls what renewables go where, and it's not really up to the unit-by-unit building manager, and is there any way to allow for renewables, because I think that would be an important part of the carbon charge.
That's a really good point. I think so you could think of production and consumption. I think you made the point that this report was about consumption and not production. I mean, we in the economics department don't produce energy. We just use it. So, and that's true of actually most of the administrative units around campus. Facilities thinks about that, and I think part of I'm not speaking for facilities, but I know it's part of their thinking about to what extent we can use renewables such as solar as a substitute for fossil fuels. One of the things about using the carbon price is it gives you a benchmark. So you can say, okay, if putting up a solar array is saving carbon at $1,000 a ton, that's probably not a very good idea. If it's saving carbon at $10 a ton, that sounds like a good idea. So I think one of the most important parts of it is actually giving you a benchmark for decisions. It's not just a floor but a cap. But it gives you some guidance on should you change the lighting here? Should you install motion detectors there? Should you put in a big solar array out of the athletic fields? You don't just do it. You actually use a benchmark. Say, well, okay, what is it costing? What's electricity bringing in? And at this $40 a ton or whatever price of carbon, is it paying for itself? So I think that's actually gives a lot of discipline to the process as well.
I think it also could play a really important role in terms of growth of the university and in new construction, because it will be factored into not only will it be used as a price to analyze different decisions in building new buildings, but it also makes units think really closely about their space, and if they want to grow that space, I think renewables could be a way in which they counterbalance that growth.
Peter Hirsch, the Yale School of Forestry. My question is about those sort of shared services that everyone at Yale takes advantage of, specifically data centers. How are those getting integrated into the Yale Carbon Plan? And I know that West Campus has just installed a ton of solar, so maybe there's some connection there.
I think this gets into the tangle of Yale budgeting, and actually I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable to answer that. IT, my understanding, IT is in the Vice President of Finance Administration. So is that correct? Yes. Okay. So how that's going to, I don't actually know whether that is therefore going to be something that will be charged to the Vice President and Finance Administration's budget, and if there's some enormous growth of computer clusters, that will be charged there. I think those are the kinds of details that we did not have time or expertise to determine. Part of the problem with Yale budgeting is things get charged to all different kinds of things, and you can't always, it's like spaghetti, you can't always find out where they're being charged to. So, and I think this is actually one important one. My sense is, though, that the solar arrays at West Campus are not going to be part of the West Campus budget, but I'm not sure about that. But I think this is an issue we need to, in general, peel apart all these different budgets so we can make sure that decisions and charges, budgets and decisions are in the same room, in the same office, in the same unit. We don't want people making decisions about energy and somebody else paying the bill, because that's a recipe for just poor decisions about use.
So I don't know the answer to that specifically, but there are some more sort of simpler examples in which the energy bill is paid by allocating those energy uses to whatever, if 3 departments share a space, there's an allocation calculation. So potentially one solution could be to simply also allocate the charge, since it'll be attached to that energy usage. In the case of data centers, though, I'm not sure how that energy bill is allocated.
Yeah, I have another question. So this is about the scope 3 that Jennifer talked about. It seems like even if there's no way of applying a carbon charge, it seems like what Professor Nordhaus said earlier, that the measurement is the first step, that he was surprised that other campuses didn't even monitor what emissions come from what buildings. I don't know if this is within the scope of the carbon task force, but it seems that a measurement of kind of the emissions that come from commuters, and scope 3 also includes investments, so potentially the endowment portfolio, just measuring the carbon associated with that will, if not applying a specific charge to that, could allow for some sort of incentives to reduce the scope 3 if you can measure it and see how it goes up and down over time, even if that's not a $40 charge, some sort of incentive.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important point, and I think we certainly recommend that in several areas of scope 3 emissions, specifically air travel to start, we start trying to measure that better right away. You can sort of split scope 3 emissions into 2 different categories: areas in which Yale has operational control and areas in which Yale doesn't. So air travel, for example, that Yale is paying for, absolutely we could ultimately implement a charge on that. Commuting emissions is much tougher because Yale doesn't pay your gas bill to drive your car here, and so it'd be much more challenging to implement a charge on that. At the same time, the Office of Sustainability is really working towards measuring all of these scope 3 emissions much better, and those under which Yale does have operational control, I think it's really important that we start trying to see which ones we really can measure and which ones are large enough and impactful enough that we should really put the time into measuring accurately, so that we can ultimately, hopefully, not too many years down the road, implement a charge on them. And air travel is certainly the first one in that bucket. And so I think right away we'll start trying to work with the University Budget's office and figuring out how we can get appropriate metrics in place for that.
I would say also, I don't think anyone on the task force thought the only thing the university is going to do is a carbon charge. So, more bike racks, maybe changing the pricing of parking, more videos, conferencing kinds of things are all things that the university, is doing, is moving forward on, that's kind of independent of the carbon charge kind of area. Some of them will be encouraged, I think, actually, by the carbon charge, but it's not as though there are not going to be other environmentally sensitive things that the university does.
And is there any plan to measure the emissions associated with the endowment in addition to all the other scope 3 stuff?
That was not discussed in our task force.
We actually discussed the issue of what we covered, and there are 2 different ways of measuring an institution's footprint. One is operational control, the other is financial control, and we settled on operational control. That's what the sustainability people thought. That's what most of the people on the task force thought. I think the endowment is another set of issues, and that's just. I have lots of opinions on that, but our task force did not tackle that issue.
Sandro Gomez, mechanical engineering again. I have a hard time understanding the whole thing. We can appeal to people in terms of their ethical behavior. So you have to behave right and try to save energy and minimize your carbon footprint. But the system of carbon charges or carbon taxes is based on providing incentives or disincentives towards good behavior or bad behavior. So the thing that I have great difficulty in understanding, for example, you made the example of parking. If Yale were to cut down dramatically the cost of parking for motorbikes, for example, that would be an obvious thing to incentivize the use of motorbikes with smaller carbon footprint than cars, but Yale doesn't do that. Here instead, we're looking at the program that overall is revenue neutral. And if I understood correctly, there is no mitigation incentive for the university as a whole to go in that direction, in the direction of reducing the overall carbon footprint. So where is the incentive, disincentive kind of thing that makes this thing work?
It's marginals.
I don't know if my question is
Yeah, I guess I have a different conception of the university than you do. I think the university is me and you and the people in this room. It's the people making the decisions, the people running the schools, the people with grants, the people buying equipment, the people deciding whether to fly or drive or stay home. That's what I think of as the university. It's a kind of a big holding company for all of us. And so what we need to do, the problem is if you have these goals only at the top, they never come down to the people who are actually making the decisions. So the purpose of this is to actually have the incentives flow down to the people who are buying the equipment, ultimately who are flying or deciding whether to fly or not, and who are working with others to make decisions about energy use. This is not part of the plan, but let me give you a simple example. Let's say that air travel was included. And so now flying someplace costs an extra $100. It's not going to, but could easily cost $100 round trip business class flight to Europe or something like that. Probably more, maybe 500, I don't know. I think that would influence people's behavior. And so that's actually one that, it's interesting, that's one that the task force was in a way reluctant to do, but that might be the one that would be most real to people and actually have the most salience to people if suddenly the cost of these airfare, their airfare went up by the amount of the carbon.
I understand your point perfectly, and so, but that's Scopus 3. Can you give me another example of Scopus 1 or 2?
Well, again, the example of equipment was the one I would use. When people don't take into account, I don't think people even know when they buy equipment what the energy use is on it. I mean, some do, but many don't. I mean, how many of us, when we buy our computers, actually do the life cycle calculation on the energy cost? I know I don't. Maybe some people in this room do. I'm sure some of you do. But
And how many people leave the computer on all night?
A lot I don't do.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, well.
Okay. So just one other thing. I think you make a very good point. And when the people from facilities made a presentation, they emphasized just what you did, that the things that individuals can do on their own, by themselves, on a day-to-day basis, right tomorrow, are relatively small. They're a relatively small fraction of energy use and emissions. But when you include other things, such as, is a building open 24 hours a day or not? Do we actually work with facilities to get lighting that's not on all the time? Do we have a system where one of the buildings we heard, one light goes on, all the lights go on? And then there are all kinds of, and then there are other things as well. So when you expand it from turning my heat on and off, which might be 0, to the other activities that we can do jointly, particularly at the departmental level. They emphasize the departmental level, which is the building level. The scope for changes increases. And then when you think of the longer term, when you have changes in structures, equipment, growth of facilities, or more intensive use of space, I think then even there the scope for action is even larger.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Winuk. I'm a student at the School of Forestry, and I just also wanted to say thank you for taking the time to really think this through. I think it's been a very thoughtful process so far, and I would just say that I'm excited to see how it unfolds this semester and the next few years. And my question is, I was wondering if throughout this process you've thought about a specific role that you'd like to see student support in, beyond kind of just knowing about that it's happening and making personal or individual changes, but kind of really more institutional support either within schools or at the university-wide level, and kind of what recommendations you may have for students who are interested in getting more involved.
You got some ideas for us?
I have ideas, but I don't know that I should say them because no one's approved them. So
No, go ahead. No, really.
Jennifer, that doesn't sound at all like you.
I'm being recorded though. I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities, especially around Scope 3, right? Because we have a huge issue with not having the measurements in place, and it's going to take a lot of time to actually better understand how we, take airline trips that faculty and staff are taking and actually translate that into carbon emissions, and then figure out how we can simply and adequately implement a charge off of that. So in cases like that, I think there's a lot of opportunity for student involvement in terms of studying mechanisms to effectively do that, and then also just putting in the hours because it's going to be time consuming.
I'm going to say something that all my colleagues probably won't like very much, but I think you should go see your chairs, your deans, and say, hey, what are you doing? Did you read this report? What do you think? What are you doing? What are we doing? Let's get off our duff. Let's get involved. And one of the things I'm particularly excited about is actually doing experimental programs and programs that bring awareness of these issues to the different units. And I think two areas just stand out: the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the medical school, where you have lots and lots of departments, and they don't pay attention to any of this because they don't pay the bills. And it would really be interesting to see how we can get these two big entities, which are roughly 80% of the university, if you include all the associated parts, how we can get them involved. So I'd say, go talk to people. If you think this is a good idea, go get people in your school or department interested and say, hey, what are we doing? Let's pay attention.
Yeah, I also want to add that I think sometimes students also don't realize that they see the university in a way in which a lot of sort of staff, especially facilities, doesn't get to see it. So, I can tell you John Bollier is not in dorm rooms at 2 a.m. and realizing that they get really, really hot. And so students open the windows in the winter because it's too hot in their rooms. And so things like that are stories we've heard sort of more anecdotally. But if students actually sort of take the initiative to understand that, this has implications and that, they can, alert and notify the correct people, what happens to buildings? Do all the lights go on when you're studying at 1 a.m.? That's not something that, a lot of people know. So I think there's also just an awareness to report these things. That's important.
Mr. Provost, do you have further remarks?
I didn't have, but let me try. So what people can do. The gentleman from mechanical engineering. I think we are sometimes guilty of feeling a little bit more powerless than we are. So on the faculty side, in the provost office, I get many emails a day, many emails a day, where there are personal incentives to have rules changed in the university. So, I'll get several a day saying, can I use my research grant to buy my children's clothes? By the way, the answer to that one is no. With there's little incentives, personal incentives to get things in, and people lobby like crazy. So, you can, if it's the case that in Mason Lab that the heating is bad or isn't individualized enough, then that's something you can lobby. Now you have an incentive to lobby for that, and that makes a difference. I think that comment that Jennifer made earlier, that all these changes you make, like putting in switches that make the lights go off when they should, or thermostats that are individualized, the rate of return on those are going to look much better now if we can have a carbon charge. So I don't quite buy it that we're quite as powerless as we think we are. When I'm getting lobbied in the provost office, you guys seem plenty powerful to me.
All right. So maybe I'll just say, I think we're ready. I think we should wrap this up. People have other places to go. We're done on the task force with our formal work. We've conveyed the report to the president and provost. We very much hope this goes forward. As it goes forward, I think I think there are going to be lots of ramifications. There are going to be lots of effects, and I'm sure we don't anticipate all of them. I hope they're pleasant and not unpleasant. I hope they're favorable ones. But this is a pretty substantial program and a pretty substantial incentive. This is not a Mickey Mouse program, as I said. So I will personally be very interested in rolling this forward and seeing how it looks. I hope many of you who come out to hear it and talk about it today will stay involved. And I particularly want to thank the task force for its wonderful work and collaboration in developing everything we've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.